So I didn't quite know how to take it. So I just kind of left that there. And one time he asked me, and I said, maybe. I wasn't ready yet. I didn't want to say no, but I wasn't ready to say yes. I still had to see which way his life went. Well, when we got married, I was 27.
So did he ask you the first time when you were like 25 or something?
Oh, maybe 23.
Oh, okay. That's pretty young.
That's pretty young. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't know it started like that early. Like the asking.
Well, the asking? Yeah, the asking started kind of early.
You just tortured him for like 4 years?
Yeah, when he started to, it looked like he was going to start to have some girlfriends. I married him.
As soon as you saw other women moving in, that's funny.
Yeah. He was just starting to feel like confident and everything, and I married him.
Desperately and definitely want to hear about your wife, Tammy.
Yeah.
And also, you're so well known for your views on men, or how your ideas have been taken up so enthusiastically by young men, but we want to talk to you about women.
Yep, that's good.
So, but one of the things you and I share is that we both grew up in Canada. I promised Christine I would not do my Canadian accent while you were here. But you grew up in rural Alberta. I grew up in Toronto. And you are, the country's most famous guru now since Marshall McLuhan. But is the fact that you came from Canada have any effect on your views, do you think? Has it formed you in any way? I mean, would it be the same if you think you'd grown up in rural Texas? How has Canada contributed to your worldview?
She's always looking to
for the Canadian angle.
Canada, so
hey, we have listeners in Canada.
Well, I think the particular part of Canada I grew up in probably was formative to some degree. I mean, the town I grew up in was only 50 years old, you know, and the particular part of the world that I grew up in was really the last settled part of the North American prairie.
This was outside of Edmonton, correct?
Yeah, about 400 miles north of Edmonton.
Oh, 400 miles.
Yeah, it's right at the tip of the...
short distance.
A short distance.
Yeah, so the prairie stretches up that far north. It stretches up farther north in Alberta than it does anywhere else in the North American continent. And so we were at the tip of viable farming, essentially. And so it was a new place, and it was a rather raw place, and it was a rather harsh place in many ways, especially because of the winter. And it was fundamentally a working class place, although a prosperous working class place, right? Because most of the industry there was related to the oil and gas industry, and although it was cyclical, when things were good, working class people could make a very good living.
This was during the 70s, so through the whole...
Yeah, that's
was
right.
Was it fun to be a kid in 400 miles outside a small town? But
yeah, I liked it when I was a kid. I wouldn't say it was as fun when I was a teenager. Right. But I'm not convinced that, you know, the majority of people who are teenagers necessarily have the most wonderful time of it. I think adults often look backwards at the past through rose-colored glasses. I think that's what the cartoonist Trudeau accused Reagan of doing continually. Gary Trudeau.
You're at the American Enterprise Institute. Don't insult Mr. Reagan.
No,
I'm kidding.
I think the words you used for it in your book was teenage wasteland. I think is what you called it. But it's Canadianness. How does that formed you or affected you, if at all? Maybe it didn't.
It's hard to say. I mean, I've lived in lots of different parts of Canada now, and Canada's quite different. I lived in Alberta for a while, and it had this particular flavor of existence. I mean, mostly in Fairview, I was striving to leave and to move ahead, let's say, or to move, I hesitate to say up, but somewhere different, somewhere more urban. But that's the case with many people. I mean, the small towns all across the West, in the US and in Canada, are dying. I mean, they're down to nothing because everyone's moved to the cities. I lived in Montreal for a good while, and that was interesting because it was a very, very different culture. It was a culture that was to some degree stratified by language and by class, and none of that was true in Alberta because it was so new that there's no class structure. Right. So that was quite interesting.
Right, and you worked, what I loved, I pulled a passage because I think, as you say, people are born in small places everywhere and some want to leave and some don't. You said, I wanted to be elsewhere. I wasn't the only one. Everyone who eventually left the Fairview I grew up knew they were leaving by the age of 12. I knew, and my wife, who grew up with me on the same street, knew. What was that thing? What would you call that? What's the thing that makes you want to leave and sets you off? Because as you point out, there was no class system. Education was cheap in Canada compared to the United States.
Oh yeah, it wasn't cost that was stopping people.
You were from a, what, middle class order?
Yeah,
You worked
my
in
father was a
paper?
teacher and my
would know.
mother was a librarian, although she had trained as a nurse. So, you know, we had a comfortable, I would say, a suburban lifestyle, essentially.
Right.
You know, a moderate middle class suburban lifestyle. That's what Fairview looked like. It looked like a suburb that was built mostly in between the 1950s and the 1970s. So,
The young Jordan and the then young Tammy, and you have to tell us that story, how you met, but wanted more.
well, you know, I think that's one thing that is different to some degree about class. My father and my mother had both left the towns they were from, and they were forward, future-looking people. And, you know, most of my friends who quit school and who didn't attend university, they didn't have that sense, I would say, that more developed sense of a world outside of what they knew. And the other thing is that my father took us on long trips when I was a kid. He was a teacher, and so he had summer holidays, and we drove all over Western Canada and down into the US, long driving trips, thousands of miles. And, you know, that also gave us the sense that the world was a bigger place. But I knew way before I was 12, I believe, that I was off at least to university. And I think generally in your family, if you're liable to go to university, people don't even really talk about it. It's just a given that that's what's going to happen. It's something that you take in with every breath almost. It's often an unspoken expectation. And maybe people make casual reference like, well, when you go to college, but it's not like there's a question about it. Whereas if you're from a working class background, especially if your family hasn't pursued post-secondary education, that isn't in the realm of unspoken or spoken expectation. And it wasn't like lots of my friends, including many of them who dropped out before they hit high school, they were by no means the dimmest people in the class. Like, they were plenty smart, but they weren't oriented towards the idea of pursuing a career that involved intellectual engagement wasn't in their worldview. And, you know, when you hear people on the, let's say, more socialist end of the distribution talk about barriers to education, they often talk about cost. And sometimes